In 1823, President James Monroe issued a bold proclamation. It became known as the Monroe Doctrine. This doctrine declared that the United States would consider any European attempts to colonize or interfere in the Western Hemisphere as a threat to its national security. The Monroe Doctrine emerged at a time when newly independent Latin American nations were vulnerable to European ambitions. It initially aimed to prevent further European expansion in the Americas. The goal was to protect the sovereignty of these fledgling nations and solidify the United States' position as the dominant power in the region. Over time, the Monroe Doctrine's interpretation and application evolved. It shifted from a primarily defensive posture to a justification for U.S. expansionism and interventionism throughout Latin America and the Caribbean. What began as a statement of non-interference gradually transformed into a rationale for U.S. dominance in the region. This shift in interpretation had profound implications for U.S.-Latin American relations for over a century. The Monroe Doctrine's evolution is evident in key historical events. The United States annexation of Texas in 1845, which ultimately led to the Mexican-American War from 1846 to 1848, demonstrated a more assertive application of the doctrine. The United States used the doctrine to justify its westward expansion, often at the expense of its southern neighbors. Interventions in Cuba, Haiti, Mexico, and Panama in the late 19th and early 20th centuries further solidified this trend. These actions, often justified as necessary to protect U.S. interests or maintain stability in the region, cast a long shadow over U.S.-Latin American relations. The era of overt U.S. interventionism in Latin America began to wane during the administration of President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Roosevelt's Good Neighbor policy, implemented in the 1930s, marked a departure from the interventionist approach that had characterized previous decades. This policy aimed to improve relations with Latin American countries through cooperation and non-interference. The United States sought to position itself as a more respectful and collaborative partner, moving away from the paternalistic and interventionist tendencies of the past. The end of World War II ushered in a new era in international relations. The United States, emerging as a global superpower, embraced a foreign policy centered on collective security and multilateralism. The creation of the United Nations and other international organizations reflected this shift. This new focus on global engagement and cooperation seemingly superseded the unilateralism inherent in the Monroe Doctrine. The doctrine, once a cornerstone of U.S. foreign policy, appeared to fade into the background as the United States embraced a more collaborative approach to international affairs. The presidency of Donald Trump signaled a potential return to a more assertive and unilateralist foreign policy. Trump's rhetoric and actions, particularly regarding Latin America, evoked the language and sentiment of the Monroe Doctrine. His America First agenda prioritized U.S. interests, often at the expense of international cooperation and diplomacy. This approach had significant implications for the United States' relationships with its neighbors to the south. Trump's focus on countering Chinese influence in Latin America further fueled comparisons to the Monroe Doctrine. He viewed China's growing economic and political clout in the region as a threat to U.S. interests. This concern echoed historical anxieties about foreign powers encroaching on the United States' sphere of influence. Trump's administration employed a combination of economic pressure, diplomatic maneuvering, and military posturing to counter China's growing presence in the region. These actions, however, often had the unintended consequence of pushing Latin American countries closer to China. The long-term consequences of Trump's policies on U.S.-Latin American relations remain to be seen. Critics argue that his assertive approach has damaged relationships with key regional partners, undermined U.S. credibility, and ultimately strengthened China's position in the region. They contend that a more collaborative and respectful approach is needed to address the complex challenges facing the Western Hemisphere. The future of U.S.-Latin American relations hinges on navigating a complex geopolitical landscape. The United States must contend with the rise of China, address pressing issues such as migration and climate change, and find ways to promote economic development and democratic governance in the region. A successful approach will require a nuanced understanding of the historical dynamics at play, a commitment to diplomacy and cooperation, and a willingness to engage with Latin American countries as equal partners.